It was in these days of October that the plague began here in Perugia. First it started in San Pietro, because the monks there received another monk suffering from the plague, who had come from lands suspect for the disease. But he survived, and the abbot left with some monks, and of those who stayed, many died. For this reason, it was ordered on behalf of the Monsignore that they, the monks still alive, should not go to the city of Perugia and stay inside the monastery with doors locked. In these days, many citizens left the city with their families and went to the contado, and many students set out as well. This is how the 15th century Perugian chronicle, known as the Diario del Graziani, describes the beginning of a major plague in the city that lasted from 1447 until 1450. Interestingly enough, the Diario identifies an initiator, a sick monk who came to the Benedictine Abbey of San Pietro, situated just outside the gate of San Pietro, from a suspect area. In other words, one sick person could be seen as the immediate cause of the whole epidemic, not the corruption of the air in and around Perugia, but one single case of infection. Then the death of several monks left behind in the monastery prompted the Monsignore, that is the papal governor of Perugia, to order a lockdown, a kind of quarantine ante litteram. That it was ordered not by the Monsignore, but on his behalf, may well mean that by then he had also left Perugia, just like the abbot of San Pietro with some of his monks, the citizens who fled to the contado, and the students who decided to leave and, presumably, go back to their hometowns. No event is explicitly connected to the plague in the Diario until next spring, when on Holy Wednesday, the 20th of March 1448, Roberto Caracciolo, a young but already famous Franciscan preacher who had arrived earlier to preach during Lent, I quote, organized a procession with all the religious of Perugia, where present were the Monsignore and the priors, and all the noblemen and noblewomen, and generally all persons of higher rank, continuously singing litanies and some lauds and prayers. And some women were dressed in white, and the procession went to the church of San Pietro, praying God that the plague come to an end. Unquote. If the Monsignore left the city in October, now he has come back, just like those members of the urban elite who could be among the citizens fleeing to the contado previously. It seems that the danger of infection, which prompted the Monsignore to a categorical reaction in October, with setting up a quarantine, did not matter now, or it was deemed smaller than the advantages of the procession. At the same time, the procession went to the very place where the whole epidemic is said to have started, to the Abbey Church of San Pietro, virtually confirming the theory shared with us by the Diario that the sick monk was the fons et origo of everything. Fleeing from the city, setting up quarantines or introducing other measures of public health ante litteram, as well as organizing religious processions within the city. These are the main types of reaction to plague epidemics in late medieval urban environments, especially in Italy, and the present paper wants to problematize and discuss their relationship. Doctors and urban authorities alike, in Perugia and elsewhere, regarded plague as an atmospheric and contagious disease at the same time, thus fleeing the plague, that is going to places not contaminated either by infectious air or by sick persons and their contagious personal object, as well as contemporary measures of public health, like restricting movement within the city and through its walls in order to stop the spread of the disease, or trying to keep the city clean of dirt and waste deemed capable of corrupting the air, all seem to have been consistent with the supposed nature of of the epidemic, in contrast to organizing processions and participating in them. In this context, modern scholarship has focused on the tensions between collective religious practices and public health concerns. According to Richard Palmer, civic authorities did not ban processions or similar events until the end of the 15th century, even if this option was sometimes taken into consideration, as in Brescia in 1469, where the Corpus Christi procession was finally allowed to go, since, as the minutes of the city council formulated it, I quote, "From the sad solemnity and devotion to it, liberation and health are to be hoped for, rather than greater infection." Unquote. Nevertheless, the authority of the health offices was steadily increasing, writes Palmer, and in 1497, preaching was already banned and churches were ordered to remain closed in Venice due to the plague, a decision repeated with increasing frequency during the 16th century. In Florence, the earliest similar measures mentioned by John Henderson were introduced at the beginning of the 16th century. Henderson postulates that the adoption of such restrictive policies went together with conflicts, I quote, between those who advocated an appeal to God and a pragmatic faction anxious to avoid spreading disease. Carlo Cipolla has pointed to a number of such conflicts in 17th century Tuscany. By contrast, Samuel Cohn has found collaboration rather than conflict between church and state in fighting the plague in 16th and 17th century Italy. As to flight, the discourse of its permissibility on grounds of theology and religious morality from Petrarch onwards has been studied thoroughly by Heinrich Dormeyer. The disruptions in public administration, including by implication at least the enactment of public health measures, caused by the absence of qualified personnel, has been pointed out in several cases, just like the related problem of keeping the potentially sick out of the city, including, again by implication at least, those who fled from the plague ravaging elsewhere. Nevertheless, the relationship between processions and flight has remained, as far as I know, an entirely neglected topic. The juxtaposition of processions and flight helps to understand at least three interrelated groups of problems in late medieval urban communities trying to cope with epidemic outbreaks. The first concerns the city as a political community. To what extent was the struggle against plague a public matter and not a private one? Whose responsibility was its organization and its consequences, intended or not? The second group of problems is about the city as a religious community. How much did rituals of atonement require large-scale cooperation, and whose cooperation did it require? How were collective and individual forms of penance related to each other? Finally, the last group refers to the city as a territorial community. Was the entire urban space to become the target of collective measures against the plague, or merely its boundaries? Was it a medium of atonement to be resacralized, or a medium of infection to be avoided? These problems are, of course, rather broad and far-reaching. In such a short paper, I can hardly offer more than a better grasp of them. Thus, in order to make this offer, I will focus on one of their main implications, the potential conflict between processions and flight. The specific set of questions I would like to answer is when, how, and to what extent this potential conflict came to the fore in a particular Italian city in the course of the 15th century, in a city that has largely been neglected by research on late medieval plague epidemics. The procession of the 20th of March, 1448, which went to the church of San Pietro, and where we left the story of the Perugian plague of 1447-1450 in the introduction, was repeated on 4 consecutive days, going each time from the cathedral square, where Roberto Caracciolo, the organizer, was preaching, to another church or group of churches in the 5 administrative districts or porte of the city. Thus, the altogether 5 processions followed the main roads of the city from the center to the suburbs in the shape of an asterisk, instead of going along the city walls that seems to have been the traditional route of plague processions. As Jussi Hanska put it, I quote, "Walking around the walls, the procession formed a sphere of protection against the plague, which, unlike a flooding river, was something that man could not localize. Choosing a circular route was a common custom in processions performed because of epidemics." Unquote. In contrast to this, covering the urban space as a whole through its constitutive parts, instead of focusing on the walls alone, seems to imply that the disease is everywhere, and in order to stop it, more is required than protecting its borders. It is not just an outside adversary, but also an enemy inside. Whether or not I interpret the considerations behind them correctly, Roberto's processions as social events were apparently quite successful. I quote, "The whole populace went to them with great devotion all the time, because everybody was frightened and scared on account of the plague. And woe to those who fall ill, because, being afraid, fathers and mothers leave their children, and everyone flees. And the plague continues to proceed by striking its victims, and everybody is alarmed." Unquote. In other words, if the author of the Diario is right, Perugians participated in the processions in great numbers, not despite being afraid of contracting the disease, but because of it. Mingling with many potentially ill people was apparently not something to worry about, even if the fear of individual cases of infection within the family was stronger than parental love. The dissolution of family ties is of course a widespread topos of plague literature that we find among others in the Decameron as well. Quote, "Brothers abandoned each other, uncles abandoned their nephews, sisters abandoned their brothers, and wives frequently abandoned their husbands. And fathers and mothers were loath to visit and care for their children, almost as if they did not belong to them." Unquote. In the Diario, this topos is used to confirm that those who went to the processions had all reason to be afraid of falling ill. Left alone, no one has the slightest chance to survive. Of course, we do not know, neither can we, if this was indeed the typical motivation of Perugians to participate in the processions, but referring to their fear of abandonment must have been a typical way of understanding their behavior. And it also suggests that apart from the explicit goal of asking God to bring the epidemic to an end, strengthening solidarity in the city could also have been part of what participants expected from their collective ritual. After all, a major theme, possibly the main theme, of Roberto's preaching in Perugia was private peacemaking, the necessity of stopping the constant rivalry and strife between families. His first sermon in the cathedral square on the 3rd of March was about holy peace, and it lasted for 4 hours. At the end of the sermon, he organized a peacemaking committee consisting of 4 citizens per district, with the aim of mediating social conflicts in the city. In his subsequent sermons, he kept on criticizing the practice that major families, after having buried their members, leave the family flags used during the funeral processions in the churches. As a consequence of this practice, I quote, "There were so many of the sad flags in the churches that one touched the other," as the Diario paraphrases the preacher, implying, it seems to me, that even holy spaces are implicated and used as battlegrounds in the fights for prestige and power. His last sermon before leaving the city was about holy peace again. Besides the motivation of the participants to join the processions, a further implication of this passage quoted from the Diario is the already mentioned paradox of fearing the ill child, but not fearing the crowd, if these two attitudes characterize the same persons indeed. We will return to this problem later on. Here I would merely like to point out that Roberto Caracciolo's processions were not the first occasions involving many people in the streets or at the same place in Perugia in 1447-1448. Roberto himself arrived in the city on the 5th of January to deliver his first sermon 2 days later in the church of San Francesco al Prato to, I quote, quite a number of people, including citizens of higher status, unquote, as the Diario reports. When on the 3rd of March he preached in the Cathedral Square, as mentioned above, he did so for 4 hours, and people began to occupy good places on the square at 5 in the morning. On Good Friday, he staged an open-air dramatic representation of the Passion, featuring local laymen and laywomen as actors. And it was not only Roberto who organized mass events in these days. Still in October 1447, right after the outbreak of the plague, news came that Alfonso of Aragon, King of Naples and Sicily, would visit Perugia. As he was going around central Italy with a large army, this was no minor issue. The Orvietans had already received him with great honor, and Perugia could not afford to lag behind. For this reason, the citizens who fled to the Contado were ordered to return to the city. The king eventually did not come. He decided to destroy the surroundings of Volterra instead, but another high-standing guest took his place. On the 30th of December, the Pope's mother arrived in the city, and she met, according to the Diario, I quote, all citizens of importance, unquote, who, by implication, could not be in their summer retreats in the Contado. Thus, even if someone believed in the causal connection between attending mass events and contracting the disease, it may have been too late to start worrying about infection in the crowd in late March, when Roberto's processions took place. A complete lockdown, banning all gatherings, markets included, required such a developed public health administration capable, among other things, of securing food supply, that Perugia at this point could not perhaps even think of. And if there were many gatherings anyhow, then, given their religious significance, the processions were the least reasonable to be afraid of. What sort of remedy could the processions offer? In addition to appeasing God, diminishing the fear of abandonment, and strengthening solidarity in the city, the participants could also expect from the processions the supernatural benefits of being in the proximity of the preacher-organizer himself, who was perceived by his audience as a holy man. When, after his last sermon, on the 7th of April, Roberto, I quote, descended from the pulpit, everybody followed him like a saint until the convent of San Francesco. And having taken a meal, he set out from Perugia in the direction of the gate of San Pietro, where many people escorted him. And a part of the sad multitude escorted and accompanied him until Deruta, and another part of them, men and women, escorted him until Todi. And he preached there for several days, and many of our Perugians stayed for his sermons in Todi for the whole time, until the said brother Roberto left. And those who could touch his tunic or his hand held themselves fortunate, unquote. Such a man could be expected to perform miracles, and the mere fact that he persevered in preaching every day in good health and great vigor in a plague-ridden city could be interpreted as a heavenly sign. Nevertheless, If there were hopes related to the miraculous or intercessory capacities of Roberto in Perugia, they did not come true, or not in the short run at least. On the 20th of April, some 2 weeks after his departure, the priors and chamberlains of the Comune reserved 5,000 florins in the urban budget for expenses related to the plague in the subsequent 5 months, including the cost of free medical care for everyone who contracts the disease. In May, an ad hoc committee of 10 citizens was elected, I quote the Diario, to take care of and provide security for the city of Perugia with regard to the plague, unquote. On the 15th of June, the city set up a guard of 250 men, consisting of 5 equal units, sent by the 5 districts of the city, with one such unit being in charge at a time, quote, for the protection of the city, unquote, as the Diario put it. In Florence and Venice, plague guards also had the function of protecting the properties of those who had left the city for being afraid of contracting the disease, thus it may have been the case in Perugia as well. On the 22nd of July, the priors and the ad hoc committee proclaimed that those residents of the city, whether citizen, peasant, or foreigner, who went to the contado in order to avoid the plague, but, in spite of such a precaution, had become ill or died, were not allowed to return or to be brought back to the city under penalty of 50 florins and 10 rounds of strappado, and the same punishment applied to the guards who let them in. This ordinance probably implies that not merely the ill or dead runaways, who as residents would otherwise be entitled to enter the city, but any other ill person coming from the outside were to be stopped at the gates as well. Without this implication, it would have made little sense. More than 20 years earlier, in 1425, the priors had already decreed, apparently for the first time, that, I quote, no one is allowed to return from areas where there is plague and enter here, unquote. The emphasis on runaways in June 1448 may well have been an attempt to control plague flight, the dimensions of which looked notable for the Council of Priors already at the beginning of May, and on the 7th of June the papal governor, the highest authority in the city, is also reported to have moved to Deruta, some 20 kilometers south of Perugia. But whatever the exact motivation behind the decree of the 22nd of June was, the efforts at protecting the city were focused, just like in 1425, on keeping the infected outside instead of separating the ill from the healthy within the walls. The secular authorities aimed at the enemy outside, leaving the enemy inside to their ecclesiastical counterparts. On the 14th of September 1448, the Papal Commission entrusted with probing into the sanctity of Bernardino of Siena, whose process of canonization was unfolding simultaneously with the events we are talking about, heard 3 witnesses at Bruffa, a few kilometers southeast of Perugia, about 2 miracles that were said to have happened there. It must have been for this reason that another major Franciscan preacher and the main promoter of Bernardino's canonization, John of Capestrano, had also come to this village of the Perugian contado. It was from Bruffa that he counseled the authorities of the city to organize another large-scale procession against the plague. Turning to such external saintly advisors in the course of plague epidemics and other calamities was not an unusual phenomenon. Florentine authorities, for example, before organizing crisis processions, as Richard Trexler called these events, frequently consulted holy men or women coming from the outside, whose exceptional charisma was seen more fit for finding the right way of appeasing God's anger in such exceptional situations. September 1448, I quote, "At the advice and suggestion of the venerable father and friar John of Capestrano, preacher in the order of Friars Minor," unquote, the priors proclaim that, quote, "each and every religious and cleric of whichever order or rule who live or stay in the city or in the suburbs of Perugia are required, just like all disciplinati, that is, flagellants, and the members of all other confraternities of the said city, to go in procession for 3 consecutive days, starting tomorrow, in the name of God. In the morning, upon hearing the sound of the bells, let them be in the church of San Lorenzo, that is the cathedral, prepared and lined up to go in procession in the said city to places which will be announced, to implore and pray God Almighty that in His compassion and great mercy deign to revoke all the deadly plague from the city or the contado of Perugia," unquote. In contrast then to the series of procession organized by Roberto Caracciolo, these new ones were not for everyone, but only for those who were, in a way, professionals of prayer. The others were expressly forbidden to work or keep their shops open under penalty of 10 lire, and those who could, that is, not too ill or weak, were required to fast, as well as to abstain from all mortal sin during these 3 days, I quote, "in order that the prayers and supplications of the devout and good religious be granted more attention," unquote, as the proclamation says. The processions were to start, as in March, in the city center, in the cathedral, but the way to be followed must have been different, because the duration of 3 days is not suitable for repeating the asterisk-shaped pattern. The 3 days evoke the traditional liturgical model of the Rogation Day processions, on the Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday before the Feast of Ascension. John's suggestion then seems to have been entirely different from Roberto's. Different participants, length, and route. Was it so because Roberto's processions were not successful? Was it a return to a more traditional pattern? As to the length, it may well have been so. As to the route, we should know something more specific about it, beyond its presumable difference from Roberto's route, to make an inference. As to the participants, however, it must be noted that this was not the first procession against the plague in Perugia after the departure of Roberto Caracciolo in April. According to the minutes of the Council of Priors, there was such an event already on the 12th of July, with the participation of all clerics and all disciplinati carrying relics of the saints, starting from the Cathedral of San Lorenzo. In other words, it was the same conception as that of John, but for merely 1 day. The minutes also record that the city gave candles to the Augustinians and the Franciscans for their own similar processions on the 21st of July with relics and monstrances. Thus, John in September merely tried to intensify these attempts by professionals of prayer to halt the epidemic after the processions in July had, apparently, failed to do so. But given their failure, it would have been reasonable on John's behalf to expand the circle of participants to everybody. That he did not do so suggests that this factor was a compromise in September, and probably in July too, since a large part of the Perugian population must have been out of town. We have seen before, concerning the processions of Roberto Caracciolo, that Perugians, according to the Diario at least, do not seem to have been afraid of getting infected in the crowd, even if they did fear infections in the family. Although we do not know if these two attitudes characterize the same persons, or that, on the whole, how widespread these attitudes were, being afraid of the ill did not necessarily imply being afraid of the crowd. If being ill meant exhibiting certain symptoms, then the ill could be potentially spotted in the crowd. Or, if the symptoms included fever and fatigue, then the ill could hardly endure the processions. Moreover, people walked in processions with their relatives of the same sex or with their fellow artisans, not with strangers whose health condition was completely unknown. Whether these hypothetical explanations or rationalizations are correct or not, there is no trace of anyone having been worried about participating in mass gatherings during the epidemic of 1447-1450 in Perugia. Thus, when the news of the canonization of Saint Bernardino of Siena, celebrated in Rome on the 24th of May, 1450, reached the city a few days later, and the friar of the Franciscan observance, Andrew of San Gimini, started to preach about Bernardino on the cathedral square, I quote, "A very large number of people went to hear his sermons," as the Diario reports. Then, on the 28th of June 1450, a great procession was organized in honor of the new saint from the Cathedral of San Lorenzo to the Church of San Francesco al Prato. A special committee elected for this purpose started to make arrangements for it 10 days earlier, and the city supported it with 200 florins. According to the Diario, not merely the entire urban elite, including the priors and the papal governor, went there, but also, I quote, "many citizens, including women, children and adults, all with candles in their hands at their own cost," unquote. A few lines later, we also learn from the same source that, I quote, "in these days of June, the plague started to grow stronger, which did a great harm," unquote. The author did not make any connection between the two events. It was not the problem of infection in the crowd that started to cause visible conflicts around the practice of plague processions in Perugia in the second half of the 15th century. It was the absence of processions. The plague or series of plagues in the second half of the 1470s provides the first well-documented example. A first phase of it seems to have been rather mild. The continuation of the Diario dedicates merely one laconic sentence to its beginning and first victims. I quote, "It was on the first day of June, 1475, that the plague began here in Perugia, and many people died," unquote. We do not know how many, but their death seems to have been the exception rather than the rule, which would account for the long gap in the text without any reference to the epidemic until the entry of the 29th of June, 1476. From this entry it comes to the fore that until then, I quote, "the plague had proceeded by striking occasionally, and it was almost only in the district of Porta Sant'Angelo," unquote. But thereafter, I quote again, "because of fearing the worst, almost everything was emptied in such a way that few people stayed in the city, and the elderly were saying that they saw the plague in other times, but they never saw the city having been deserted so generally, and to those few who remained there, it seemed very somber and frightening to see so few people in the city." More than a week later, from the 7th to the 11th of July, a 5-day procession was organized by the Comune for those, I quote, "few people who were in Perugia," unquote, as the continuator of the Diario put it. It repeated the asterisk-shaped pattern of the processions of Roberto Caracciolo in March 1448, with partly different churches in each district as endpoints. Although the continuator of the Diario does not mention any fear of getting infected in the crowd, to the last destination on the last day, the church of Sant'Agostino in Porta Sant'Angelo, I quote, "went only few people because of the many who died of plague and had been buried in the said church," unquote. This observation seems to corroborate my hypothesis mentioned earlier, that acknowledging the danger of infection in its obvious forms did not imply being afraid of mass events in general. In contrast to any participant of the processions, the corpses buried in Sant'Agostino were known to have been infected. Approaching them posed a clear threat, whereas being in the crowd was an immediate remedy for the distress caused by living in a half-empty city. Unfortunately, however, in spite of all emotional comfort these processions may have provided, they must have been rather ineffective against the disease itself. Thus, some 2 weeks later, on the 27th of July, a new series of processions was announced, in the words of our chronicler, I quote, "because of the plague that continues to do immense harm," unquote. This time its mastermind was the Servite friar Bonaventura Tornielli of Forli, who had come to preach in Perugia in those days. According to the continuator of the Diario, I quote, "The said friar, preaching in San Lorenzo to that small part of the populace which had remained in Perugia, was talking about how angry God had become at the people of Perugia, and that he learned about this from God, for which reason he exhorted everyone, those of the city and also those of the countryside, that they have to confess and take communion, that they have to make amends for all their sins and errors and return devoutly to God, and to go in procession devoutly for 15 days and fast for 3 days from the 15. And those who cannot fast have to recite prayers and give alms and do other good things. And those who had left Perugia for fear of the plague, those who went to fortified towns and villages, have to be notified that everybody must return to the city," unquote. The differences between the previous series of processions and the one designed by Fra Bonaventura suggest that the failure of the former was attributed to its having been too short and too limited in terms of the number of participants. Or, at least, these were the factors Fra Bonaventura deemed possible to change in the hope of enhancing the effects. On the other hand, his words also seem to imply that in order to placate God's anger, it does not suffice to confess one's sins, do the required penance, and have communion. Individual atonement is not enough, even if everybody follows suit. Collective prayer in the form of processions is also needed. As an anonymous sermon on plague that has survived in a 15th century Franciscan manuscript partly written in Perugia notes, I quote, "Every devout prayer pleases God, especially when it is recited in common by many." Explanation: because, just like much wood make a big fire, and still more a bigger one, and if you add all, the biggest, it is the same with prayers. This is why processions have been invented, in which there is a great fire of prayer, so that the smoke of spices, that is of prayers, rise from the hand of the angel before God, unquote. If the number of participants matter, then processions performed by merely a smaller part of the populace, the professionals of prayer, or those who happen to be in town, is far from being the best ritual measure against the plague. If the efficiency of processions is supposed to depend on the number of participants as well, then the ethical concerns involved in fleeing the plague-ridden city become more complex. The moral responsibilities of anyone considers the flight are extended from the minimum of family and closer relatives to strangers or potentially to all citizens. Being absent diminishes the chances of those being present for pleading divine mercy efficiently. It may not have been by chance that such a tension between plague flight and plague processions appeared right then. In 1477, the Council of Priors decided to establish a lazaretto, an isolation hospital specifically dedicated to plague patients outside the walls. The first such institution was founded in Venice in 1423, and by 1477 there were at least 6 other Italian cities which also had one. The Perugian Lazaretto was in an area now belonging to Cenerente, some 4 kilometers northwest of the city walls, close enough to be reached easily and far enough to keep the contagion away. Until this moment, secular authorities in Perugia, as we have seen, concentrated their efforts on preventing potentially ill foreigners and citizens from entering the city, leaving the problem of the disease inside to their ecclesiastical counterparts. Now they also started to remove the sick from the city and separate them from the healthy. Such a policy, even if it was an attempt to disinfect the city, inevitably highlighted the dangers of infection inside. To be sure, in 1476 the Lazaretto did not exist yet, but the underlying conception of epidemics and public health, the need for a thorough separation of the ill and the healthy, must have been widely known and trusted by that time. We have seen at the beginning of this article that the papal governor set up a quarantine ante litteram restricted to the Benedictine Abbey of San Pietro already in 1447. And what is a better way of separating the ill and the healthy, from an individual point of view at least, than fleeing the plague-ridden city? Of course, plague flight does not simply depend on motivation. Fugitives need to have a place to go. The received view in scholarship seems to restrict the problem of having a rural plague refuge or not to economic status. The wealthy could escape, the poor could not. But as it had already been noted by Anne Carmichael, plague flight also required precise knowledge of the spread of the disease in areas surrounding one's place of residence, which, in turn, needed a relatively dense and stable network of informants. And it took some time to build such a network. In accordance with this, Shauna Kelly-Ray has argued, on the basis of last wills with identified places of redaction, written in most of the cases on behalf of already ill testators, that there was little plague flight in Bologna in 1348. Then, besides the spread of the disease in the surrounding areas, one had to consider further factors as well, like military operations going on in the Contado and beyond, or the problem of leaving behind unguarded property. The role of property, if not urban property, may well have been crucial in the development of plague flight in Perugia, as its economy was characterized by a strong tendency of ruralization, ruralizzazione, since the beginning of the 15th century, as Alberto Grohmann and others have shown. This tendency implied a constant flow of capital from manufacturing and commerce to investment in agriculture and landed property, without resulting in the creation of large-scale unified estates. In such a situation, those in the upper, but not merely in the uppermost echelons of Perugian society, who benefited from this tendency, had far closer ties to the Contado than their ancestors, which must have made their plague flight easier to organize. Some tension between procession and flight must have been around for some time before 1476 as well, even if it had not been made explicit by anyone, or it had not called the attention of the chroniclers known to me. That the absence of many citizens had to be reckoned with when organizing processions against the plague seems to be implied by the practice of limited processions featuring merely professionals of prayer instead of the entire populace. That in July and September 1448, for example, 4 such limited processions were held in a series without any perceivable effect rules out the explanation that the organizers were simply experimenting with the number of participants in a trial-error fashion. It was rather the length and the route of the processions that appears to have been open to some experimentation. The circle of participants must have been determined by the circumstances in the first place. Limited processions were more like services to the community by professionals of prayer than common rituals of expiation. The latter, in contrast to the former, were perceivably advantageous for the participants in terms of strengthening solidarity and mitigating fears, even if their explicit goal of bringing the epidemic to an end was not attained. On the other hand, in Perugia, plague flight does not seem to have become a political issue, and it may have been for this reason that it did not catch the attention of the chroniclers as a problem to be mentioned or discussed in its own right. It is true that in early 1449, for example, when the epidemic began to keep a low profile, absent professors of the university were threatened with losing their salary if they would not return, or exiles were allowed to come back to the city, probably to compensate for the lack of personnel in the guilds and the urban administration. But there is no trace of plague flights having ever become an issue of class tensions like those Marchionne di Coppo Stefani reports about a failed plot of the Gente Minuta to overthrow the Florentine government in the plague year of 1384. I quote, "Having recognized that the plague started rather early in the city of Florence and many citizens had fled, some to the Contado, some beyond the Contado at a distance of 1, 2 or more days, they, the Gente Minuta, believed that their time had come. In the said year, many laws were passed that no citizens could leave because of the said plague, for they feared that the Minuta gente would not leave and would revolt, and the malcontents would unite with them. Then, seeing that the rich were still leaving, the government began not to allow anyone to leave without a special permit, but it was impossible to have them abide by this either." Unquote. In the aftermath of the Ciompi revolt, the situation was clearly different in Florence, but it is nonetheless significant that no fear of the lower classes is mentioned in relation to the plague in any of the Perugian sources known to me. It is not politics that brought the problem of plague flight to the fore in Perugia, but its excessive proportions in 1476. These excessive proportions may well have been connected, as I have suggested earlier, to the establishment of the city's first lazaretto and, in the longer run, to the increasingly closer ties of many citizens to the Contado. Nevertheless, plague flight and its relation to plague processions did not remain in the limelight after 1476. Its place was taken over by concerns of public health, albeit not along a simple ecclesiastical versus secular front line. Preaching in the Cathedral Square on the 22nd of July 1486, in the course of the next major plague, the observant Franciscan Bernardino of Feltre exhorted everyone in the city to go to Assisi on the occasion of the Perdono, the 1st and 2nd day of August, when pilgrims could obtain plenary indulgence. Trying to minimize the time to be spent in purgatory by visiting a nearby pilgrimage site in a situation when the chances of sudden death were high was far from being irrational, and the urban authorities initially supported the preacher, but 2 days later, probably because Assisi in the meantime became affected by the epidemic, they changed their minds. I quote, "And on the 24th day of July, it was announced in Perugia, on behalf of the papal vice-legate and the magistrates, the lord priors, and the officials of the plague, that no one may dare or presume to go to the Perdono of Santa Maria degli Angeli, that is Assisi, under penalty of 25 scudi, and not being allowed to return for 40 days, that is the time of a regular quarantine, and thus the preacher was not obeyed." Unquote. It is not the case that the priors or the new magistrate of the officials of the plague, introduced at the end of the previous epidemic, decided to counter the admonishments of Bernardino da Feltre, while the ecclesiastical authorities supported him. He was apparently not supported by anyone. The growing concerns of public health did not create two stable camps, an ecclesiastical and a secular, fighting over the legitimacy of collective religious rituals in times of plague, but they increasingly set the coordinates of any decision or policy made in such circumstances. As a consequence, plague flight, an immediate danger for the places of destination, and plague processions looked less different than they had before, even if keeping people outside the city walls was to remain for a long time much easier than efficiently controlling their movement within them.